what I tried to do was take away all my opponent's army, and then I figured whatever I had left, I would try to checkmate them with, which was a pretty good thing, right? Figured that I would try to checkmate my opponent only after I captured everything I possibly could of my opponent. Sometimes the game went excessively long. Let's say that I did really good, and I actually won the game, which was a miracle. I mean, miracles happen. Sometimes it's like, you know, once on a full moon, I once won a chess game. And I've been watching games at the club played by players who aren't that experienced. And so they try to do the same technique as me. Take away everything of their opponents, and they don't see checkmating patterns. So the goal of chess is to checkmate our opponent's king. Fair enough. So let's learn some of the most typical checkmating patterns. So in this position, we would say from a material count, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, the pawns are even. Black has 2 rooks, which are worth 10, as we know, 5 each, versus a queen, which is worth 9. And yet, white has a forced checkmating pattern here. Do you all know this pattern? Not everybody. I know Charlie does. I know you do. So the checkmating pattern is, we're looking at black's king for a moment. We're thinking to ourselves, well, how could we set up a checkmate? We notice that our queen is pretty close, but the queen by itself can't deliver checkmate. In other words, if we play queen takes g7 check and say checkmate, what if our opponent disagrees with us? And he goes, no, I'll just take your queen. Oops, we just lost our queen for a pawn. So we start to think, what else besides our queen can attack this pawn? Young lady.
Well, the white pawn can move F6.
Correct.
Captured, and then the queen will be able to check.
Precisely. So this, in fact, sets up what we call a checkmating pattern. And it's one of the most common types of checkmating pattern there is. So our threat is to play now queen takes g7 check and mate, because the king cannot capture the queen. The queen is protected by the pawn. So black has no choice. He has to advance his pawn. Now what can we do? Now what can we do, young man? Queen h6. So this move, white slides his queen to the h6 square, and black, to his horror, realizes that there is no way that he can prevent our next move. He can move his rook if he likes, he can move this rook if he likes, but he cannot escape queen g7 check and mate. It's one of the most common checkmating patterns. And what I did when I was a kid is I had what I call my arsenal. Yeah? What I mean by that is I had a number of checkmating patterns, excuse me, a number of checkmating patterns that I became familiar with, so I put them in my arsenal of checkmating patterns. So this is one of the most common checkmating patterns. Let me change for a moment, and I'm taking the pawn that helped us make the checkmating pattern away from the board. You don't have it anymore. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a bishop on the e7 square. And now, when I was young, without a doubt, you know what I would do? What?
Take the rook.
Absolutely. I would take that rook and I'd be very happy because I would say, my bishop is worth 3, your rook is worth 5. That trades in my favor, and yet capturing the rook is the wrong move. Instead, young man in the blue, yes. Absolutely. A moment ago, we had a pawn. And that pawn, we call this, it pierced. It pierced. A moment ago, you see this pawn shield by black's king. That pawn shield's really, really good. But when we put a pawn on f6, we pierced the pawn shield. With the bishop, we do the same thing. Once again, in this position, we are threatening queen g7, captures queen, captures g7, check and mate. Black is not allowed to capture our bishop because that would place his king in the direct line of fire of white's queen. So black has to play the move g6, and we play checkmate. We play queen to h6. We slide just as we did with the pawn. So the bishop began to be as good as the pawn. The bishop protects the pawn on e6. The bishop protects the queen on g7. Our next move is going to play queen takes g7. Now I'm going to change the position for a moment. The last move by white is he's going to play queen here, threatening a checkmate. Okay? But black has a way of defending his g7 square. How? Young man.
Move the knight to f5.
Correct. Not only moving the knight to f5 protects the g7 checkmate, but oops, it also threatens the queen. Oh dear. White's in trouble, right? White's in trouble. What could white do to create a checkmating pattern? Young man.
Queen takes h7.
Whoa, did you see this move? Queen takes h7, check to the, but that's a terrible move. He'll just take our queen. Then we're dead. White has to resign. Charlie.
Rook to h1 check.
Rook to h1, check to the king. Now I understand the power of the bishop. The bishop reaches to the h8 square. I'm going to block the check. Young man. Rook takes h6 check. Now I have no choice. I have to drop back with my king. And young man.
H8.
Rook to h8, checkmate. So this checkmating pattern, the black king cannot take the rook. The rook is protected by the bishop. The black king cannot move to g7. That square is protected by the white bishop. And the black king cannot move to f7 because that square is occupied by his pawn. So this checkmating pattern has a very important setup. Notice that the bishop is on the long diagonal and it protects the h8 square. Now, what we determined a moment ago is in this position, white played the move queen h6, and then this move queen h6 was answered by knight f5, protecting the mate threat. Did white need to play queen h7? Queen h6? Charlie?
No.
No, why?
You could just play queen takes h7 check now.
Right?
And then king takes, rook takes 1 check.
Yeah.
And king takes and then
Exactly. He didn't need to delay sacrificing his queen. He could have done it at once. Some of you have seen these problems before. You're probably very familiar with them, but all they are patterns. Patterns that recur time and time and time again. And they come from all kinds of openings and all kinds of positions. So, black, in this position, he sees that his pawn on c3 protects the square b2. He moves with his queen here, threatening checkmate on b2 as well as checkmate on a1 thanks to the protection of the rook. Queen e7 to a3 was played by black, and white realizes he's dead. He's dead. He's going to get checkmated either on the b2 square or the a2 square. So white could resign. White could give it up, congratulate his opponent, but white has a desperate idea. What's his idea? Rook to h8 check. What's that? Is that just a check and then we get to resign? What are we doing? We're going to take the rook. And now, yes? Queen to h5 check. Where can the king go? Only one square. King to g8, and now we have a checkmate. Do you guys all see the checkmate? The pawn on g6 attacks the f7 square as well as the h7 square, so that we could play the move queen h7 checkmate. So this pattern, a moment ago our pawn was on f6 and we were checkmating on g7. With this pattern, our pawn is on g6 and we're checkmating on h7. Let's go back a moment. Black did not see this rook check. Okay? Black did not see this rook check. I need a queen. Had he seen that rook check, he himself would have what should black have done? What should black have done? This move actually looks like it's winning, but as we've just seen a moment ago, it loses the game. Young man.
Black should have played rook a1.
Black should have played rook a1 check. Do you see why? White has no option. He has to take the rook. The b2 square is protected by the pawn on c3. We take the rook, and now it's black's turn to deliver checkmate. How could black deliver checkmate? Young lady, yes. a3. a3. Queen checks the king on a1. White has no choice. He has to move his king to b1, and now our familiar checkmating pattern.
Queen
Check and mate, indeed. And that checkmating pattern, just as we saw with the pawn on f6, I would put that in my little chess scrapbook, and I would say, okay, now I have two checkmating patterns with a queen and a pawn, as well as a checkmating pattern with a rook and a bishop, or a queen and a bishop. And these checkmating patterns come from all types of positions. So this, of course, is not a checkmating pattern. There's no checkmate. Black's king is very, very solid. It has this beautiful shield of pawns that are standing there protecting black's king. On the other hand, black has two pawns, what we call two pass pawns on the queen side, and those pawns are rushing down the board, and they're going to try to make a queen. Now, when I was a beginning player, I wanted to capture all my opponent's pieces, take them off the board, and only when I had captured everything would I try to win the game. So in this position, I would only consider the moves rook takes. I win a pawn, I'm so happy. Or I would consider the move knight takes b8, winning a rook. I'm so happy, right? And I'd overlook that, in fact, there is a checkmating pattern here. White has a checkmating pattern. Does anybody know the checkmating pattern?
Oh.
Charlie.
Queen to h7, check. King takes h7, rook h3, check. King d8, knight e7, checkmate.
But what about king g6? Oh, king g6. There's no checkmate. What Charlie said is if the king went back to g8, we have a knight smothered mate the black king. You see that knight smother mate the black king. So let's go back to this position. Young man.
Knight to e7.
Knight to e7 check. Now notice after the knight comes to e7 check, the king is kind of trapped behind his own pawns. He can't capture his own pawns. The rook stops his king from moving to f8. The only move is king h8. And now, queen takes h7 check. King takes rook h3 checkmate. Wow! How cool was that? The rook attacks the black king. The black king, can the black king move to g6?
No.
Because?
Of the knight on e7.
Correct. The knight on e7 protects the g8 as well as the g6 squares. Black's king is checkmated. I would never, not in a million years, have thought of this combination myself when I was starting chess. I was trying to capture all of my opponent's pieces, not give up my queen. Oh my. I have this story, and it's one of my favorite stories. When I was starting to play chess, I was very lucky. I had a chess teacher, and his name was Jeffrey Parsons. And he was a really strong player. By the United States Chess Federation standards, he had a 1,900 rating. How many of you know what a 1,900 rating means? Yeah, he was what we call a Class A player. And he was also a very, very wonderful teacher. This pattern was my absolute favorite. I loved this pattern, and Jeffrey gave me this problem, and he said to me that I had the white pieces and that I could win the game. And I thought, that's impossible. I can't win the game. Black has a rook and a rook, 2 rooks. I have no rooks. And black is threatening to capture my knight. And I will be down a rook. If I capture the queen, what's wrong with that move? Young man. Yes.
Because the rooks can capture you.
The rook could capture my queen, and an entirely different checkmate occurs. This is called the back rank checkmate. The rook attacks white's king, but white's king can't move to any squares because he's blocked by his own pawn shield. White is checkmated. There's a book called Bobby Fischer Teaches Chess. How many of you have seen that book? Okay. The entire book, I kid you not, has one trick and one trick only in the entire book. And that's the trick that we see on the board, the back rank checkmate. Bobby Fischer thought the back rank checkmate pattern was so important, he devoted an entire book to it. When I read the book, I thought to myself, this guy Bobby Fischer is the world champion. He's a one-trick pony. All he knows is the back rank checkmate. I could beat him. So we go back to this position, and again, Jeffrey said, no, Yasser, you have a winning combination. And I thought, okay, Of course, I will play queen to d5, checking the black king on g8. The black king cannot move to f8. Why? And then checkmate on the move with queen on d5 to f7, check to the king. The king can't go anywhere, and the king can't capture the queen because the knight protects the queen. So this would be checkmate, and I'd add this to my arsenal of checkmating patterns. But of course, black will not move his king to f8. Instead, he will move it to h8. Young man.
And then we move knight.
Absolutely. I would play, okay, now, by the way, keep in mind, I was very clever. I saw that black's threat is to checkmate me. I'm still in the back rank checkmating pattern. So everything I do has to be with check. So of course I understood that I had to play knight to f7, check to the black king. Black's king has no choice. And now, because I want to grab material, oh, I was so happy taking my opponent's pieces, I can't tell you. I would take the rook with check. How many of you think this is a good move, winning a rook for free? Yes, that's what I would do. I would take that rook with check, and he's in check. He cannot play here because of that very same checkmating pattern as before. The knight protects the queen. Checkmate. So black has to go here. Now what did I do?
Backward check.
How?
Oh.
Ooh. And remember, I'm facing back rank check. Mate. Black is still threatening his checkmate. Furthermore, he's threatening to capture my knight.
Oh.
What?
Knight f7.
Of course, that's exactly what I did. He moved his king back. Charlie.
Knight h6 double check.
Knight h6 double check. Now the king is under attack from the knight, so that's a check from the knight. But the check, the queen also checks the king on g8, so that's why we call this situation a double check. Again and again and again, king f8 is a bad move, as that allows us checkmate. So he, my opponent, would have to move his king to h8. Yes, young man? Sorry?
I forgot.
Okay. So now what can I do? Yes?
You move your queen to g8.
Okay. Queen to g8. Wow. That's a sophisticated move, but I don't get it. I cannot take the queen with my king because the queen's protected by the knight, so I'll take your queen with my queen. Ooh, thank you very much. And I'm threatening your knight, but more importantly, I still have the dramatic back rank checkmate for black. I blew it. Let me say right away that I was unable to solve this problem. I tried everything I could, all kinds of checks and everything I could, and I couldn't win the game. It was terrible. I failed. So then I asked Jeffrey, please show me the solution. What did I get wrong? And I got the first move right, check. I got the second move right, check. Here's where I got the third move wrong. I took the rook. I was so happy to take the rook, but you guys have probably solved the checkmate by now. There's the knight h6 double check. King moves over to h8. Now, check. Do you see the difference? A moment ago, we captured the rook with the queen. Now we're capturing the rook. How? What can black do? What can black do? Yes, young man. take the queen, and then what does, again, white is facing now not just once, but twice back rank mate. Now, smothered checkmate. Oh, wow. I was so happy. I was so happy with this smothered checkmate. I couldn't contain my excitement, and I ran home, and my mom was washing the dishes. So I dragged my mom out of the kitchen, brought her to the dining room table. I set this up. I set up the problem. I showed her the double check with the knight, and I showed her the smothered mate. I was so excited. Do you know what my mom said to me? She said, "Very good, Yasser. Can I go back and wash the dishes now?" She didn't get it. This was really, really pretty. I sacrificed my queen to force a checkmate. And that was really the start of how I got to be very excited about chess, is because I started to learn how to create checkmating patterns. And I would look for all of these patterns, all of these different ways of checkmating my opponent. One of the ones that I really messed up on, this happened to me. I was black in a tournament game. It was one of my first tournament games I ever played. In fact, what happened was, in my first tournament ever, it was the 1973 Snohomish County Open in Snohomish, Washington. I come from Seattle, and as you guys know, all good things come from Seattle. It's a bad sign. So I had the black pieces in a situation like this, and in the first day, which was Saturday, I played 3 games and I lost all 3 of my games. Oh, brutal, brutal. On Sunday, I came back, and a miracle of miracles, I won 2 games. So my score was 2 wins and 3 losses. And they gave me a prize. I won a prize, a trophy. I was the best player under the age of 16 years old, and I got a trophy for that. But did you know I was the only player under 16 years old? So even if I lost all my games, I would have won the trophy. So here, what I did is I captured the knight. And can you see a checkmating pattern for white, young man in the blue? Rook d8 check. Now, is this a back rank checkmate? Why not?
Because instead of a pawn, there's a bishop.
And so what does that mean? I can block. Black can block. And I was black. And I blocked the check to my king by putting my bishop in the way. And I thought the position was even Stevens. Rook and bishop versus rook and bishop, 3 pawns versus 3 pawns. I was hoping to make a draw, but I couldn't. Why?
Because white can play bishop to h6.
Bishop to h6. And I felt so physically helpless. I can't do anything about rook captures. Like, I could move my rook, and he would take my rook, and then I could move a pawn, but then white has a checkmate. How? Charlie. Checkmate. Notice that in this pattern, before we had a pattern that looked like this. Remember this pattern? Where our bishop supported our rook and we checkmated on h8. Well, now we have a different pattern. Now we have the bishop on h6 supporting our our rook. So after a move like f5, rook takes f8 is checkmate. The king can't take the rook because it's protected by the bishop. The king can't go to g7 because the bishop protects the g7 square. Can't go to h7 because h7 is occupied by the h7 pawn. So in this position, when we start again from this position, we're going to put a rook on the board. We give a rook check. The bishop blocks the rook. The bishop is in what type of a pin? Charlie? An absolute pin. So what that means is that whenever a piece is pinned to a king, the piece absolutely cannot move. So when we played this move bishop to h6, normally speaking, black might try to take our bishop. He absolutely cannot do that because, Charlie, attacks the king. So the bishop can't move, and the move rook takes f8 is impossible to stop. I felt physically helpless. Charlie?
I think there might be a way to stop that, and that might go rook a1 check.
Rook a1 check.
I forgot about that.
Otherwise it would be a back rank checkmate and white would lose the game. King to g2. Now we could give one more check if we liked, but after king takes, once again, this threat of rook takes f8 check and mate is unstoppable. So what I tried to do when I was a kid is I was looking for all of these checkmating patterns, and I was thinking to myself, if I could list a whole arsenal of checkmating patterns, I would become better and better. Another checkmating pattern that I really, really loved, you guys are probably familiar with this one as well, and this is called the two-knight mate. So this position looks dreadful for white, right? He's down two rooks, and black is threatening all kinds of checkmates. What checkmate is black threatening? Black is threatening a checkmate. Charlie, what checkmate?
Rook a1 or rook h1.
Rook a1 is checkmate. This rook on h2 covers all of the squares along the second rank, and white's king is in check. This rook is also threatening rook to h1, as Charlie said, and again it's checkmate. So this was another pattern that I put in my arsenal. So white is, does white have to resign? It's white to play. Can white save the game? Can he?
Yeah, king to g1.
King to g1, but then, for example, say knight to g6, and eventually the two rooks are going to win the game. So we need a better move. Young man, yes. Knight e7 check. Well, the black king can't go to f7. That square is protected by this knight on e5. I have to go king h8. Young man in the blue. Knight f7. Isn't that a pretty checkmate? The knight on f7 attacks the king. The king cannot go to g8 because that knight on e7 attacks that square. Black is in checkmate. So this was another checkmating pattern. How about this one? White to move in checkmate. Charlie.
Knight to e6 checkmate.
Knight c8 to e7 check and mate. Do you see that pattern? This knight on g6 attacks the h8 square as well as the f8 square, so black's king cannot go to either square. This knight on e7 puts the knight in check. This knight can't be captured. Checkmate. So this was another 2 horsepower checkmate. And so what I wanted to say about today's class is I created a whole arsenal of checkmates. And today, if we wanted, we could go to my home, and I have 32 scrapbooks, of positions that I put in my scrapbook, and I said, these are important positions, and that I have to recognize these patterns when they occur. And I would take a book or a magazine, usually magazines and newspapers I cut up. I took out the diagrams, I pasted them, and then I gave the winning move. Sometimes on books, however, since I didn't want to destroy the books, I would make a copy of the diagram. Then I would cut them and put them in. So I created an arsenal, all the weapons of checkmating patterns that I could find. You know what I discovered? I discovered that there were a lot. There are dozens of checkmating patterns. And all of them were rather unique and really, really interesting. So I know that in your journey to become champions, you're going to have to learn a lot of these patterns as well. And the more patterns you know, the better you're going to do.